Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, there are over 100 new weapons added in with the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, and while some of these are quite obviously strong, others are a bit more of sleeper hits that take a little bit to find the real uniqueness and special things about them. But past that, there are of course other weapons, ones that, while incredibly interesting for the most part for one reason or another, are just missing that last bit of oomph to make them generally feel worth using. Whether that oomph be a bit more damage, a bit more hyper armor, or something more unique or specific to that weapon. So today we're just going to talk about 10 new weapons that I think absolutely need to be buffed, as well as how I do it personally. And as usual, I'll go in a sort of game progression order so as to not spoil you unexpectedly if you aren't fully finished the DLC quite yet. First up then we have the Spirit Sword. This also extends to the Spirit Glaive. They are both new weapons, a very similar weapon of another type, honestly, but the Spirit Sword itself is especially more than a little bit sad in my opinion. This is a ghost flame themed curved sword, but due to the shape of it, it just has insanely poor range compared to most curved swords. It's basically like you're swinging around a dagger as far as weapon hitboxes, because in this game, hitboxes do match the visuals of a weapon, and this leads to just a lot of misses that feel like they shouldn't miss. Past that then, the weapon skill on it is a neat idea. It is basically sword dance, but it fires out slow-moving, low-tracking ghost flame projectiles. Basically, my fix to this weapon personally is let it stay low range on the melee hits themselves, let the actual melee part of the weapon be a weak side of it, but then make the weapon skill, and especially the projectiles, much stronger. Increase their speed, make their homing and tracking tighter so they're more likely to actually hit their target, and then increase the damage of the projectile specifically too. Make it essentially a ranged curved sword. Second then we have smithscript weapons, just sort of in general. To put it simply, there was a day one patch for the DLC that changed a bunch of stuff up. It moved where some items were, it did buffs and nerfs for some weapons, it changed what Ashes of War could be applied to what, and the smithscript weapons were nerfed an unbelievable amount in this specific patch. Here is one of our clips of the smithscript spear in a full-on min-max build from before that patch, which also removed the ability for it to have flame spear on it, sadly, and just look how insanely high this thing is hitting. And people reported instantly after the patch that the same setup was just hitting for pennies on the dollar in comparison, really. There was a nice little bonus bug recently though for smithscript weapons that made them scale weirdly well, with both faith or intelligence based affinities applied due to just having base scaling for both on the weapon, so it made both the physical damage and secondary damage type scale disproportionately well in a really strong way. But this was nerfed a couple days back and removed, so now for the most part the smithscript weapons are fun but relatively unremarkable. The real star of this though is the smithscript daggers, in my opinion, as far as things that really need to be buffed. This is basically its own full class of weapon. There's nothing else quite like it, as it's the only of these smithscript weapons that actually throws with every single attack it does, and it is technically listed as a throwing weapon, a unique type. The problem is the attacks aren't particularly fast, particularly damaging, or particularly good at applying status buildup either, and so it just becomes sort of like the bows in a way, a challenge run weapon more than anything else, and that's really disappointing for something that is properly ranged while also having the facade of melee. This one is much easier to suggest how to fix though, because in my opinion, honestly, they more than anything else just need more damage. Obviously, reworking damage numbers is a bit of a tough thing to get exactly correct, but the main issue with these is literally by far the numbers they produce. Third up then we have a bit of a funny one, which is all of the different perfume bottle type weapons. There were two specific bugs going on that made these essentially the strongest weapons in the game for about a week. One, an Ash of War named Rolling Sparks being aimed directly at the ground made it explode for an insane amount. Doesn't do that anymore. And two, a couple of the perfume bottles were simply bugged to do double damage occasionally, which is not a thing anymore. Both of these were fixed, and now I won't say that I think they should have stayed how they were by any means. They were absolutely busted, but without these bugs, the perfume bottles are actually incredibly mundane. I think their moveset is cool, I think visually they're very fun, but their main issue is they essentially deal little to no poise damage compared to how long their actual attacks take to get out. They give you no sort of bonus poise while you're using them, which makes it hard to even get the actual spread of perfume out, and then the actual damage output of pretty much all the attacks is pretty pathetic now as well. Sure, I absolutely agree they needed to be nerfed before, but now I think it's in the opposite situation, and I think they actually should be buffed. Fourth then is Rabbath's cannon. This is a really cool new jar cannon variation in the DLC, a magical version that fires homing shots that have projectiles that track your target. And while this sounds really cool on the surface, the truth is that the bolts fired from this cannon travel so ridiculously fast that anything within range with the target will just either be hit by it by default because it's fast, or the tracking just isn't hard enough to make it follow them because the projectiles move too quickly for it to actually adjust the course, which sort of makes the main feature of this weapon a bit pointless. It doesn't really help much, and the damage is not anywhere enough to compensate. One option to buff this would be just the straight up damage, of course, but I personally much prefer the idea of making the projectiles fired from this have much slower speed and the tracking stronger compared to like the regular jar cannon. You may view lower projectile speed as a nerf, but the way I view it is it makes it just far more likely to hit an enemy that is more mobile because it will increase the possibility of the tracking actually working. Make the projectiles last for ages so they can actually consistently always hit their target no matter what, whether they try to dodge it or not. Just make it really lean into the unique identity of this weapon compared to the normal jar cannon. Fifth today then is the barbed staff spear, and you may be thinking,
wait a minute!
Because this was on my list of weapons that are surprisingly powerful just a couple of days ago, but the reason for that is I think that this weapon needs both a buff and a nerf, because the reason it is worth using currently, the thing that makes it surprisingly good right now, is that the weapon skill probably mistakenly applies the natural bleed buildup of the weapon at range on the holy arcs that it fires out. That's fun, sure, but the main irritation I have with the weapon skill is that it visually fires out like 20 to 30 arcs if you just hold down the button and let it go on. But for whatever reason, there's like an internal cooldown on taking damage from this skill or something, so even if every arc visually passes through and connects with an enemy, they will only actually take about 5 separate ticks of damage. My proposal, quite simply, is I want every one of these arcs to hit. Even if it does less damage per arc to make up for it, of course, it would just be so much more satisfying if every single arc connected and did a separate instance of damage. That said, I understand that if that was the case the way it is currently, with the bleed being applied by the skill, it would just hit absolutely ludicrous levels, so I do think they should fix the bleed bug, but then I think they should make every arc actually capable of hitting, and this would be a really fun weapon if they did. Sixth up, we have Devonia's hammer. Now, before you say anything, this is already a really solid weapon. I know it reaches super high AR even for a colossal weapon when fully upgraded and with the appropriate stats, but my issue with it is the unique skill is basically a carbon copy of Ordovis's vortex from the Ordovis greatsword, but using this hammer. It takes longer to wind up on the hammer, and it does slightly more damage, but not enough to really justify it as its own truly different thing. My proposal on this one is very simply give it insane levels of hyper armor, like give it the highest levels of poise possible so that only the heaviest of attacks can knock you out of it. Then it becomes what it wants to be in my opinion, which is just the heavy weaponry version of Ordovis's greatsword. It does have a little bit of poise right now, but it's just not enough. If you can be knocked out by not even a boss, I think it needs to have more poise. Seventh, then we have a boss weapon from the Saint of the Bud, which is the poleblade of the Bud. This is one of the only weapons in the game with natural scarlet rot buildup, and it's just sort of sad, honestly, because the weapon isn't fully trash, it just isn't that good either. It's very middling for something incredibly unique seeming. The main issue I have with this one isn't really the damage or the poise or anything like that, though I think that it should have some sort of hyper armor on the weapon skill considering how the actual fight works, but my main problem is that this weapon from the pure scarlet rot focused boss and the actual scarlet rot buildup on the weapon is less than just using like rot grease on any other buffable weapon, especially if you have arcane scaling on the weapon. Outside of that, it applies scarlet rot just way too slow. It's not a fast hitting weapon, but it only has 55 scarlet rot buildup on it, and that just feels like an absolute crime to what should be like the scarlet rot weapon in the game. This should be the thing that applies scarlet rot, and if it's going to be that and it's going to scale mainly with arcane like it already does, maybe you should just have the scarlet rot buildup on the weapon scale with your arcane stat too. Eighth up, then, moving into the final sort of legacy dungeon area, traveling up towards the final boss, we have Euporia. This weapon is one of very, very few considered a legendary within the expansion, and you can only get it by going down a very long, very obscure, somewhat hidden parkour path with tons of danger along it. This weapon is meant to feel like the goddamn holy grail. It's that cool, like an archaeological treasure that you've just dug up. It's that hard to find, and yet its main problem is simply being far too mid. The idea is cool energy that builds up on the weapon as you attack enemies, and then powers up the weapon skill to fire a barrage of holy beams when charged. And honestly, the problem with this one isn't even really the damage that it does. The damage is honestly fine. It's a bit more fundamental than that. First, it takes far too many hits to power up the blade. If you're doing a boss fight with it statted into and fully upgraded, a lot of bosses will take so much damage from the regular weapon hits that you use just to build up the skill that it makes the laser itself feel a little bit pointless and bad in comparison. But then also, after all that, the buildup that you have, the laser version of the weapon skill is just way too easy to be knocked out of while using. It has no hyper armor at all, and that feels super unsatisfying after building it up, getting the cool startup animation, and then you just get whacked in the face. So my suggestions reasons for this are twofold. First, make it charge faster on the weapon hits, at least specifically on bosses, if not on trash, if not just in general. Second, then, give it hyper armor when you are doing the charged version of the weapon skill, while the blade is empowered. It doesn't need to be on the basic version of it, but the holy laser barrage should totally be immune to being knocked over just in general. Ninth today is the Horned Warrior's Greatsword. This weapon comes super late along the path of the DLC, and it is built up in just a million ways, with essentially 4 different enemy types wielding it in different ways before you're allowed to get your own hands on it. It is extremely cool looking, and the unique skill that is on it is very similar to the aspect of the Crucible Tail incantation, but as a weapon skill, it has multiple secondary inputs to keep swinging it around in massive extended range, and the main issue that I have with it, really honestly, is that there's just nowhere close to enough hyper armor. There's a very small amount of opponent's poise, but nowhere close to enough to actually stop any meaningful enemy from knocking you out of it. It's a big, impressive looking sweeping attack, and it's great conceptually, it looks cool, but the second you have something like this that's supposed to make you feel powerful, but you can just be slapped in the face and you stop doing it, it makes it feel way less impressive to use. The damage isn't anywhere close to game breaking, so why not just give it a bunch of bonus poise while casting to make it a more satisfying weapon in general. 10th and finally then, look away if you haven't seen the final boss yet, because this of course does have to do with his rewards, and it is a sort of duo entry for both of the remembrance weapon options from Radahn. His greatsword, Lord, and greatsword, Light. The Lord version of the greatsword has the promised consort skill, a 3-input combo with light barrages hitting the floor after every sweep. This one's actually decent, the damage isn't great, but it has insane levels of hyper armor, and the tracking is honestly a bit too much to the point where you can easily miss smaller enemies. As well though, there is the light variation of the weapon, which is basically the same weapon, but with the light speed slash as a skill, which is a jumping dash forward that can be charged up, and is followed by a barrage of light from above. This one does decent damage if you can hit all of it, but it's very, very rare that an enemy will let you charge on top of them and then stay standing in the same place. Usually they adjust in some way, moving forward with attacks or just dodging to the side, which means that the actual barrage of light doesn't really help. First things first then, I understand that this is beyond a mere buff, but I think just conceptually to begin with, these should have been the same one weapon. It should be a stance skill, like Rinaldo's weapon. Hold button to enter stance, then light attack is the promised consort combo, heavy attack is the light speed slash. Simple as that, honestly, in my opinion. As for the way it currently works though, my main issue isn't that the weapons are bad, because they're incredibly just decent. They're just not insane. And well, the boss they come from is, I think, in the running for the hardest From Software boss ever made once the dust actually settles and recency bias fades away, and that combined with also being the full-on final boss of this DLC, and it being who it is in the lore, as important as that is, it just feels like to me if there was one thing that should be designed to be brokenly levels of overpowered, it should probably be the weapon or weapons of this final boss, especially this one. So it is almost disappointing in a way that they're just sort of good. They're not great, they're just alright, and I think that these should be busted, if that makes sense. That pretty much does it for today then, everyone. Just a discussion of a fair number of weapons that I think are really cool or interesting for one reason or another, but also deserve to be stronger. There are a couple here that I think just need a general damage bump, sure, but I think that a lot of these could use a touch more love than that, and I genuinely believe my suggestions today would make every one of these weapons feel just better to use across the board. Whether they would be balanced or not, I'm definitely not the person to say, but I think that they are within the realm of being fair, and I also think that sometimes fun and satisfying gameplay should matter more than just balance, and to be completely honest, I think that this is one of those cases. I hope you've enjoyed this video then, and let me know your own thoughts on all this down in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.